I want to start this one with a question, because I think it's the thing that makes this case different from almost every other UFO story I've ever told you. When someone calls the police and says, "I was just attacked," what do the police usually do? They go. They take a statement. They walk the scene. They look for evidence. Now, what if the thing that attacked you wasn't a person? What if it was a hovering metal sphere in the middle of the woods with two smaller orbs that rolled out, grabbed your legs, and started dragging you toward it? Would the police still come? In one small town in Scotland in the fall of 1979, they did, and what they found in the dirt that afternoon is still argued about today. This is the story of Robert Taylor, a case that's often called the only alleged UFO encounter in British history that police ever formally investigated as a criminal assault. It boggles the mind and redefines what we call extremely strange. Let's go back to November 9th, 1979. The place is Livingston, Scotland, a new town out in West Lothian, built up through the 60s and 70s to house people moving out of Edinburgh and Glasgow. It's not a spooky, remote place. It's ordinary. Roads, housing developments, a motorway, the M8, cutting right through it. Just off that motorway sits a patch of woodland called Decmont Law, and within it a stretch known as Decmont Woods. Our witness is a man named Robert Taylor, Bob to the people who knew him, 61 years old. He worked for the Livingston Development Corporation as a forester. A steady job, routine work. He'd walk the woods, check the fences, check the gates, make sure everything on the property was where it should be. And here's something I want you to sit with because it matters for how you weigh everything that comes next. By every account from the people who knew him, Bob Taylor was about as reliable a witness as you could ask for. A respected local man, a war veteran, a teetotaler, a churchgoer, not the profile of someone chasing headlines or spinning a story for attention. On the morning of November 9th, Bob got in his pickup truck, drove out near the motorway, parked, and set off on foot into the woods with his companion for the walk, his red setter, a dog named Lara. It was a job he'd done 100 times before. Around 10, maybe 10:30 in the morning, accounts differ slightly on the exact minute, but it was mid-morning, Bob came around a bend in the forest track and stepped into a small clearing. And there it was. Hovering just above the ground, motionless, silent, was an object Bob would later describe as a flying dome, something in the neighborhood of 20 feet across, dark gray, a rough, almost sandpaper-like texture to the metal. Around its outer edge, a flange fitted with what looked like small propellers. It wasn't landed, it wasn't crashed. It was just sitting there, hovering, like it had been waiting. Bob stopped in his tracks and Lara started barking. Then, according to Bob, two smaller objects dropped away from the larger one, round spiked things. He'd later compare them to sea mines, the kind you'd see in an old war photograph, with metal spikes sticking out in every direction. These smaller spheres didn't hover, they rolled. Straight toward him. Bob said he caught a strong, acrid smell in the air, a hissing sound, and then the two spiked spheres reached him and clamped onto his legs, grabbing at his trousers right around the ankles, and began dragging him toward the larger object. And that's the last thing he remembered. He was out. unconscious. And for the next 20 minutes, as far as anyone can tell, Robert Taylor simply wasn't there for what happened to him. When Bob opened his eyes, he was alone. The dome, the two spiked spheres, were gone. No sound, no sign anything had ever been there, except for what was left on the ground and on his own body. He couldn't get up right away. His legs ached. For a moment, he later said, he couldn't even speak. He was dazed, the kind of disorientation you'd associate with a blow to the head, except there wasn't one. Eventually, he got himself up and made it back to where he'd parked his truck. It wouldn't start. So Bob Taylor, shaken, injured, his clothes torn, did the only thing he could do. He walked the better part of a mile back to his own house in Livingston. When he got there, his wife Mary opened the door to a man barely recognizable as the one who'd left that morning. Muddy, disheveled, his trousers ripped around the ankles, grazes on his chin and on his thighs. She didn't waste time asking a lot of questions. She called a doctor, and she called the police. Now here's where this story splits off from almost every other UFO account you've ever heard. Most of the time when someone reports something like this, it goes to a UFO hotline, a research group, maybe a newspaper reporter looking for a quirky Tuesday story. It didn't go into an official police file as a criminal matter. This one did. Because of Bob's visible injuries, the grazes, the torn clothing, the responding officers treated it procedurally the way they treat a report of a physical assault. A detective constable by the name of Ian Wark was among those who took it seriously enough to go back out to Deckmont Woods with Bob that same day and search the scene. And they found something. In the clearing Bob described, officers documented 2 sets of parallel ground impressions, described as ladder-shaped marks, roughly 2.5 meters long, laid out in a pattern about 2.5 meters apart. Alongside them, somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 small circular holes punched into the earth, each only a few inches across. Whatever had been sitting in that clearing, something had pressed down into the ground with real weight and left a very specific, very deliberate-looking pattern behind. Bob's torn trousers were sent off for forensic examination. The analysis reportedly concluded the tears were consistent with a sudden, sharp, upward pulling force. Not just fabric snagging on a branch, and not a simple fall. Whatever the police made of the UFO part of Bob's story, they couldn't wave away the physical evidence sitting in front of them. Now, I promised you at the start of this project I'd give you the skepticism along with the strangeness. So let's sit with that for a second, because it's only fair to Bob's story to look at it honestly. What exists in the decades since is a general body of skeptical theorizing. Broadly, it falls into a few buckets. Some kind of medical event, like a stroke or an epileptic seizure, the sort that can occasionally produce a period of lost time and vivid dreamlike perception. Or a misidentification, a nearby water tower, or even the planet Venus sitting low on the horizon, misread by a man in a disoriented state. None of those are fringe ideas. They're the standard toolkit skeptics reach for in a lot of close encounter cases. But here's where they run into trouble with this one specifically. None of them account for the torn trousers, torn, according to the forensic examination, in a way consistent with a sharp upward pull rather than an accidental snag. A seizure doesn't leave ladder-shaped impressions in the dirt for a police detective to measure and photograph hours later. And there's this. Bob Taylor never once changed his story. Not that day, not years later, not for the rest of his life. He talked about it publicly, gave interviews, even returned to the site for anniversaries and UFO conferences, and by every account, told it exactly the same way every time. People who study these cases for a living have called it one of the most well-corroborated close encounter reports on record, not because it's proven, but because so much of it was independently documented within hours of it happening by police, not by UFO enthusiasts. Robert Taylor passed away in 2007, and to this day the file on his case, technically opened as a criminal assault, has never been closed with an explanation. If you go to Deckmont Woods now, there's a plaque marking the spot, and a walking trail the local council put in so people could visit the clearing for themselves. Traffic noise from the M8 drifts through the trees. It's hard to stand there and imagine anything otherworldly happening in such an unremarkable stretch of woods. But something happened to Bob Taylor that morning. Something left marks in the ground that a trained detective photographed and measured. Something tore a grown man's trousers with enough force that a lab said it wasn't an accident. Whatever it was, it made a police officer stand in a forest clearing outside a quiet Scottish town and write down, in an official report, that a crime may have occurred, and the suspect was never found. So that's the story of the Robert Taylor incident. The day a forester went to check the fences and came home with a story that police, of all people, thought was worth investigating. Somewhere in a records office in Scotland, there's a case file that was opened as an assault back in 1979 and, as far as anyone can tell, was never officially closed. No suspect, no resolution, just a report sitting on a shelf that never got its final page written. If you've got a theory on who or what belongs on that page, you know where to find me. I'm Ken DaCosta, and this has been Extremely Strange.